The news in recent weeks has been full of the fallout from the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. Around the world there have been protests and counter-protests, many of them aimed at representations of the past in our towns and cities. Statues, place names and flags have all been called into question, particularly where they relate to people who were either involved in the slave trade or opposed its abolition, and those who have espoused racist views. It's raised some interesting questions. Which elements of our past do we choose to memorialise, and why? How do we deal with the decisions of the past that we no longer agree with statues of people that we no longer wish to memorialise? Does removing statues and renaming places mean that we're guilty of erasing or editing the past? These are all questions that we delve into in the History and Heritage degree at University College Isle of Man. So some of my colleagues and I have come together to debate some of these issues. So let me introduce you first of all to Tracy Taggart, who specialises in Irish history, to Paul Martin, who specialises in American history, and to Steve Jones, who specialises in the history of empire. My name's Katrina Mackey, and my specialist area is heritage. Now, a lot of the recent discussions have been around statues, and statues, like all aspects of heritage, can be very contentious. Not everybody agrees on who or what should be memorialised, and this is particularly the case and particularly problematic when the person or the event in question means different things to different groups of people. Edward Colston, for example, donated a lot of money to the city of Bristol, but he was also heavily involved in the slave trade. And there are plenty of other examples of similar characters around the world, and I believe Tracy has a particularly good example in the figure of John Mitchell.
Okay, so I'd just like to give you a little bit of background about John Mitchell, because I'm sure outside Ireland, and even in Ireland, he's not well known. So John Mitchell has come to become a lot more well known in recent weeks due to his statue being in Newry in County Down in Northern Ireland, and one of the issues with John Mitchell is that not only was he an ardent Irish nationalist and an iconic figure within the nationalist movement, but he was also a white supremacist and pro-slavery. So to give you a bit of background about Mitchell, Mitchell was born in Dungiven in the early 19th century, and he grew up in Newry. He became involved in the Young Ireland movement, which was a nationalist movement looking to separate from Britain in the 1830s and 1840s, where he started to produce a lot of literature suggesting that Ireland should become a republic, it should become its own nation. Due to this, he was tried for seditious libel and then treason, and transported in 1848 to the penal colony of Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania. Mitchell, when he got there, staged a daring escape and ended up in the United States, where he was hailed as a hero amongst the nationalist Irish American community in New York, becomes involved in the Fenian Brotherhood, and also becomes the editor of a newspaper called the United Irishman, where he talks about the injustices that were done to the Irish people, particularly the peasantry, and he looks at the famine and looks at the socio-economic circumstances of the Irish poor. However, the other side of Mitchell was that he ardently believed that black people were inferior to white people, and it's written in a lot of his letters, and he also was extremely pro-slavery, indeed to the extent of wishing to open up the slave trade with Africa again. So I know that we often say, and when his statue has been debated before by Newry and Mourne County Council, that we can't judge people from the past with views from the present, John Mitchell's views were extreme even in the time that he operated, and they were not the views of most of the Irish nationalist fraternity, particularly John Maher of the United Irishmen, and also prior to this, Daniel O'Connell, a very famous figure in the Irish nationalist movement, was an ardent abolitionist, and even prior to that, people like Thomas Russell in the 1790s, who was a United Irishman, who was eventually executed for his involvement in Robert Emmet's rebellion, was so anti-slavery that he boycotted any products that could have been made by slaves, including rum, sugar, and we think maybe even cotton. So my question is, and the question that Newry and Moore Council are dealing with now, is what do you do with a statue of John Mitchell? What do you do if your Gaelic athletic club's called after John Mitchell? What do you do if you have a place called after John Mitchell? What do you do with someone who was involved in the Confederacy as well, and was very pro the South and the Confederacy? And I think that that raises some quite good questions as well, and something that maybe we could feed into with you, Paul, with your interest in the Confederacy and the Confederate flag.
Yes, certainly the flag has been debated for a long, long time. The debates again are heated as always. I think from a history point of view, I think something that's very important with the flag, is to understand that it actually wasn't the Confederates' flag as of 1861. The battle flag that's been adopted is just one of the many flags, which was particularly associated with Robert E. Lee's army, which was a key army in the Civil War. And again, a lot of people talk about perhaps misrepresentation of history. There's a very fixed view of the battle flag as being a symbol, a racist symbol, and hate, not heritage. But a real investigation of history, which is so important with these issues, does reveal that the flag was controlled quite carefully by Confederate groups who wished to honour their dead soldiers. Now, a lot of people might have a problem with the cause that they were fighting for at the time, but there was a genuine, not imagined, not lost cause idea, a genuine reason to mourn their dead, which they did from the end of the Civil War into the mid part of the 20th century. And the flag was very tightly controlled then, so I think it's very important to understand that its use initially was from a very respectful desire to commemorate, mourn those who'd fought during the Civil War. Now, clearly, since that date, the flag has been misused, has got out of the control of these heritage groups, which again raises all sorts of issues. For me, from a historian's point of view, what I think is, again, more important with the flag is understanding where the southern states fit into American history. Reconstruction didn't force the South to conform to the ideas which may have existed in the northern part of the United States. And this is an issue which perhaps we are seeing in the present day, that the fact that the South, its ideas, how does it fit into America? And also, to some extent after the Civil War, the flag was used and became more and more, less about perhaps memorialising the dead, and more to represent what the South is all about, and Southern values, and a much wider spread of meaning, not necessarily associated with segregation and perhaps sort of racist white supremacy points of view. And as I say, in history, these are, for me, are more important issues than the obvious polarising debate on either side, because neither side shouldn't recognise that the symbol has a fixed value. To some people, it is racist. The people who exhibit the flag have racist views, but there needs to be an understanding, perhaps, of some of these other issues, that just because a person unfurls a flag they don't necessarily have the same views.
So in your instance, we have a contentious figure where a community is having to evaluate the worth of the good things that they think he's done against the negative sense of his attitudes.
There's also an added complexity because it's a statue in Northern Ireland, and because he's a nationalist statue as well, and statues and flags, as we know, are always quite contentious in Northern Ireland, and it's difficult to...
Yeah, so those debates carry through to the present day, where you have these quite polarising viewpoints. It's almost as if it's very difficult when you are memorialising somebody to encapsulate the whole meaning of whether it's a person or a flag. It tends to be quite polarising.
I think so, but you're not talking about any debate that's framed in that light is talking about one aspect. The person who is asking the question is asking from their own agenda. I think that's the issue with the flag, certainly, is that the advocates of the flag tend to be defending their own agenda, and they see that as being any attempt to attack the flag is seen as being something that's coming from centralised government, from a tradition that's been long in the States, that's something that's a danger. And the more that you try and remove that symbol for understandable reasons, the more the resistance and the more that built into that narrative. It's the same with, say, gun control would be another example of that. The more you try and take guns away from people, the more that they want to defend
That's
the right
an
to have guns.
interesting point, isn't it? Because once you start to prohibit things and once you start to have a whole blanket movement and people start to either self-censor or they can kick back against it and things become a lot more extreme, don't they? So it is a complicated and nuanced thing, and I think that's a really good way of thinking about its complex and nuance, and that's something that you learn to do if you're studying history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think often what you find is that the debate isn't actually about history at all. I mean, there's that confusion with it. I think this comes up in something we mentioned in all our different units for teaching, that history has this problem of a twin meaning. History, on the one hand, means, if you like, a series of events that happened from the beginning of the human civilization, let's say. On the one hand, it means that the events, but it also means the discipline of studying and understanding. And I think certainly that's where, to me, that it highlights that confusion when we have that issue with that kind of issue. That what am I trying to say here? That there's a real sort of tension because you've got between what are we talking about? Are we trying to actually analyse what happened in the past, or are we actually talking about events which are contemporaneous? Does that make sense?
So what do you think about that idea that's erasing history? If you take, you take problematic statues down, or you remove flags, or you change place names,
but aren't you re-evaluating history, which again is what historians should be doing?
But heritage is not about history. Heritage is very different from history. Heritage is something that a group of people choose to value at a particular point in time, and normally that group of people is people in power who have the money and the ability to raise statues or whatever, and our values change over time. So there is an argument that actually we should be, instead of constantly each generation adding new things to the body of heritage that we have, that at some point maybe it's appropriate to reevaluate and look back and say, well, actually we used to value that but we don't anymore, and how do we then deal with that? And I don't see that as erasing the past. If you look at Edward Colston, for example, he died in 1721. The decision to, his statue wasn't erected until 1895. That decision is part of history. The decision to...
Just as equally him ending up in the harbour at Bristol is still part of the history of that statue.
Exactly, but it is two separate things. And I think, whatever decisions we take today, we are forming part of that historical story.
Yes. And more people have a say in that decision now.
Yeah.
That's the important thing. Those who, particularly in the locality or in the wider population, have perhaps voting rights, have a voice that they didn't have at the time when the statue was erected.
But that difference between the two definitions of history is kind of the point. First of all, if you're defining history as being the event, you can't erase those events because those events have gone. That's actually like the tape has been written. You can't overwrite that tape. If you think about it from the other perspective, in terms of our our study of what happened in the past, then you can't really erase that either, because that is, by definition, is something that's constantly moving and constantly evolving, I think that difference between the two definitions highlights that the phrase is meaningless. It's not possible either.
I think this idea that both of you were talking about the sort of the flag, for example, the Confederate flag, having different meanings to different people at different points in time. Meaning. So it's not history; it's something else. It's what we. It's how people choose to frame their identity.
It's a discourse.
It's a discourse, yeah, exactly.
Indeed.
But for some Southern, what it is to be Southern, certainly in America, they could argue, the Southern states, that they are denied celebrating their history by the very fact of taking down monuments, having to hide the flag away maybe, and not be proud of what they consider their heritage. Are they being treated differently than every other group that seeks to celebrate their history?
That's such a difficult,
difficult
question.
The same with the Orange Walk. Is that a group of people who are simply celebrating their heritage, or is it something that is challenging?
It's both, though. It's both things. It's many things, and I think thinking of things as one thing or the other really
The problem with putting people literally on a pedestal is that you're celebrating something about them, but everybody has good and bad in them. And so the argument is, actually you shouldn't be taking down these statues, because if you leave them up, they can be used to tell us so much more about our past. Well, that's fine and well if that's actually done, and if it's done in a proper way, because you have to have that acceptance that everybody has the good side and the bad side. We all do. You might say, oh, Tracy's a fantastic teacher, but my goodness, she's terrible at maths. Do you know what I mean? So how do we... you have to accept people and events in the round and accept that there's controversy there.
Yes.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing, accepting that there's controversy. And I think today I had another little look to see what was happening with John Mitchell, because I'm taking an interest in him. And I saw that there's a petition on change.org that's been raised. I think it's actually by... could be wrong, but I think he's a historian as well at Queen's University, and the idea that maybe Mitchell's statue doesn't belong in the place where it is in Newry, but perhaps it could be brought in to another space, and it could be used as part of looking at how Ireland was involved in actually not only aspects of maybe slave trading, but actually there was a huge anti-slavery movement in Belfast, led by a lot of prominent figures there. And you have people like Mary Ann McCracken, the sister of the quite famous United Irishmen, going and handing out pamphlets to people who were going in the ships to America about slavery. And perhaps that needs to be, it could be incorporated in there, so it's contextualised so people understand, yes, this was another side to him as well, so I think that's really important, context and consent.
So how do you feel as a historian of empire that Britain has dealt with its imperial past? Because one of the things that have come up again in recent weeks has been the Rhodes Must Fall campaign about Cecil Rhodes at the University of Oxford. Because yes, as with Edward Colston, he did a lot of good. He sponsored scholarships to the University of Oxford, but at the same time, he's responsible for a lot of imperial harm.
I think it's probably, what I wouldn't want to do is get drawn into what I personally feel about it, because then it becomes more of an issue of what Steve Jones feels about Cecil Rhodes. I think it's more about what that says, that difference in the different narratives that are being created, and I think that fits into what we do study on the imperialism, which I teach, which is this idea of discourse theory, the idea that different interest groups have their own narratives they create about something. It seems to me that with Rhodes, you've got two disparate groups of people who are just not communicating at all about that, and I think that's where I see the problem coming in the debate, because there is no debate.
two polarised opinions, and there's never the twain shall meet. How do you go from one thing or the other?
Yes,
It's like Thomas Jefferson, isn't it? Obviously, party is one of the most important documents in America, Declaration, but equally again, and part of a government that's anti-slavery, but yet obviously kept slaves himself. But the University of Virginia is funded by Jefferson. Again, similar argument to Cecil Rhodes. A lot of students will benefit from being at the University of Virginia. But again, how do you reconcile those aspects?
I'm not sure you can you reconcile them. And should we seek to reconcile them anyway? Because, doesn't it open up? Because we're talking about it. The world's talking about it now. And, isn't that a good in itself?
I think that's a good thing, and I think, as we've kind of discussed, that's one of the things that the study of history can help with, because it makes you question everything. You don't take anything for granted. You always look for the other side of the story. What am I not being told? What else was happening here?
And I think in a lot of our history modules we look at that, and the module that I teach called Disputed History, and how history actually can be seen through different filters depending on the time, who's writing it, what's going on, and how much you want to do, because in Northern Ireland, sometimes during the Troubles, there were certain things you probably didn't want to handle as a historian because they were problematic issues and they could be dangerous for you too. So, so I think that's how history works, and that's how the study of history works.
But the debate about Cecil Rhodes is not, to me, about history at all. No. It's about two different groups of people who are who are debating something, which is talking more about their own actual personal views. So I think on the one hand you get those who are opposed to British imperialism and what all it stands for. Now, in some ways, I don't think it matters. I mean, if you found out, for example, I don't know, Paul, let's say you found out that your great-great-grandfather was a mass murderer, would that bother you?
It might interest me.
Yes,
I was going to say, but I think it would interest me to make, again, to look into the full story there, as you say, like mass murderer.
Yeah.
But then, as we're doing with history here, to look at the full story. And to get the full picture of what's happened. So I think I'd be more interested. I don't necessarily think, as you said, I don't know what that would mean for me to do.
That's right.
As a sort of I can't possibly right that wrong.
Yeah,
but again, it perhaps puts a lot of things. If I can turn it back again to America, the flag always for me sort of highlights the fact that hostility, you've still got sort of hostility. If the flag comes out in America, you've still got a country that's divided. 100 and odd years later, civil rights demonstrated again, and still to the current day, that America is fractured.
Because
exactly,
the current situation, not the historical situation.
Yeah, and to bring all those things into a current light, and that really, that's the area for me which is of interest. Yeah.
So we do have examples in the past of where we have made changes to place names that we consider were inappropriate. You have, throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century, the construction of new nations who set about creating a new heritage for themselves.
Well, I've got a very good example actually, the Irish Free State and then subsequently the Republic of Ireland.
Absolutely.
So when the Irish Free State is set up in 1921, 1922 and then subsequently becomes the Republic of Ireland, they have a lot of streets in Dublin and other towns and cities throughout Ireland that are called after people that they associate with British rule in Ireland. So some of them are still there. Some of them aren't, and the two big examples I can think of are, for example, Great Britain Street in Dublin was renamed Parnell Street, and then you have Rutland Square, which became Parnell Square. So one was called after Rutland, who was a Lord Lieutenant, and the big one is a big thoroughfare. If you ever go to Dublin, the famous one's O'Connell Street. That was called Sackville Street after another Lord Lieutenant, British, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And actually, you're talking about tearing down the past as well. So until 1966. There was a statue, a big pillar in the middle of O'Connell Street of Lord Nelson. And when the Irish Free State came into being, there was a debate about what do we do with Nelson? He's right in the middle of our thoroughfare, and he's rather large, and some were very pro taking him down, and others, like James Joyce, for example, Sir Oliver St John Gourlay, W.B. Yeats, who were all kind of slightly cultural nationalists, not Joyce so much, but the others, said it's part of our history and he should stay. So he did stay.
So these debates that we're having now
are not new.
They're not new at all.
Until 1966, and there's a sort of a murmuring of trouble starting to happen again in Ireland. Now, it's alleged it was the IRA. They've never fully taken responsibility for it, and Nelson's pillar in Dublin was blown up in the middle of the night, and poor old Nelson came toppling down, and then there was just a stump left. So they didn't know what to do then. They thought, do we leave the stump as a memorial? So what should we do then? And then it was deemed to be too dangerous, and then ultimately the Irish army went and blew up the stump. And then,
so is there nothing there now?
Well, I'll tell you what happened then. So there was huge souvenir hunting of people taking pieces of the pillar. Nelson's face ended up in Dublin City Library, I think. And now there was nothing there for ages. And then there was another controversy because there was the spire is there now. And some people really liked this modern piece of art and some people didn't. But it's changed the use.
What does it represent, the modern spire? Is it just a piece of artwork, or...?
That I don't know, to be honest with you. I probably have to have a look and find out what that's actually about. But, you know, it is a rather dominating piece of, O'Connell Street and the Dublin skyline. And, of course, then they changed the name of all the train stations. They're all called after the men who were executed in 1916 Easter Rising. So this is something, this tearing up the past, this iconoclasm has always been happening.
Yes.
You know.
But there tends to be a certain amount of time that has to elapse before we can regard it as being part of history. It's like it's okay once it's sometime in the past. So, for example, in the celebrations of the bicentenary of the French Revolution, they're celebrating that as being, even the upper echelons of French society are celebrating that as being a kind of glorious event, as being an inherent part of our history. They certainly weren't doing it in 1793.
Yeah.
Maybe
if you're so up close to it, you can't really see, and maybe you need a bit of perspective. You be a bit further away.
Your head's been chopped off, I suppose.
Well, you can't see anyway if your head's been chopped off. Yeah. So maybe you need a little bit of time away from it. I think that's probably, that's a good point. Yeah.
But that's always the tension, and it seems to me that's I mean, to go back to the French Revolution.
Which is what revolutions do. Revolutions change things, yeah.
So in 1789, 1791, Reflections of the Revolution in France.
I think 1791, yes.
Edmund Burke writes sort of seminal sort of conservative text almost, arguing before the French Revolution had become particularly...
it's just before the reign of terror.
Before the reign of terror. Arguing
that,
and certainly exaggerating the violence that had taken place, because he sees that as the beginning of a slippery slope. And I think that's where it seems to me that's one of the discourses that's being held by the upper and lowercase c conservatives, is that this is the beginning of something which is going to get worse and worse. Mm-hmm. So yes, you might say that if Edward Cullen is not someone we should celebrate, maybe his statue shouldn't have been allowed to remain up. But the attack on it and the imagery of people jumping up and down it—that's the beginning of barbarism.
It's the symbolism of it, perhaps,
exactly.
Isn't it? Yeah. And we do look at that when we study a history degree as well, because it's the symbolism and the actual gut feel about things that people have as well. Yeah.
So where do we go from here?
I'd just like to make a point, actually, that we still have slavery going on as well.
Oh, yes.
And I think that,
it hasn't gone
where
away.
we go from here is possibly, you can take statues down, you can rename things, but you need to follow that up with an education about why these things are problematic and help the people if they are, I hate to use this word, but othered, disadvantaged and whatever. It's part of a whole kind of big picture. And as I was saying, we still have slavery today. Where do your clothes come from? Are they made in a sweatshop in Bangladesh? Where's your coffee come from? Are you drinking free trade coffee? Where's your chocolate come from? Is it free trade? Yeah. And we all have to think, are we complicit in these things? And the thing that a history degree does for you is it makes you think deeply about things, it makes you critically analyse them, and it makes you learn how to use facts, evidence, and think about arguing with people in a respectful way and understanding debate can be respectful. It doesn't need to be shouting, it doesn't need to be confrontational, it doesn't need to be hateful.
Yeah. I'm not sure I totally agree with that though, because I mean, I don't know, certainly of all the vicious academic arguments I've ever seen,
here, aren't we?
Okay. Absolutely. But of all the vicious arguments, I mean, I think that's one of the joys of history, is that you do see historians have an absolute pop at each other sometimes.
That's
I mean,
fine, though, but they're not going out and deciding that they're going to, have physical violence upon each other.
Yeah, okay.
So that's what I'm getting at. Yeah. But it is. I'm not suggesting that kind of rough and tumble of academic life isn't what happens, but you're not going out sort of, I'm going to go out and I'm going to batter them because I disagree with what we're saying.
Most well-respected historians can at least back up their arguments properly.
That's the point, yes.
Or try to.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the point I'm kind of making. Of course, history, as we know, can be, it's very fun when you get into a heated discussion, but it doesn't need to be hateful.
That's fine. But I think one of the things that I always try to encourage in students, particularly in degree students, is I think when you're studying GCSE or A-level history to a lesser extent, but certainly the lower down the school curriculum, it tends to be that what you're encouraging students to argue is, well, so and so says this, so and so says this, but the truth lies somewhere in between.
It's
and actually,
like
it's perfectly okay.
A newspaper opinion poll.
Yeah, that's okay, and that is sometimes what you think, but sometimes you can really go for an argument.
Exactly,
and that's fun, isn't it?
I'm having a light bulb moment in history where I suddenly realised lecturers quite like it if you write polemic. They quite like it if you argue and hammer home
a point of view.
So yes, you can politely point out that someone is talking total nonsense.
And you can back it up. Yes.
You can back it up. Yeah. And therein endeth the lesson for today. I hope you've enjoyed watching this and listening to this. If you'd like to find out more, please contact us at he@ucm.ac.im.